All right, tonight we begin in Hebrews chapter 7 and in verse 1. Now, as we start tonight, let us note about the book of Hebrews, of what we're getting ready to get into. The book is comparing Christ with the Old Testament, everything in the Old Testament with Christ. The author is trying to get us to see that Christ is better in every way. And so we started out in chapter 1. The things that were revealed by the prophets were great, but the things revealed by Christ are better. They're much greater. Angels are great, but Christ is much better. Then we looked at Moses. He was great, but Christ is better. Then it was Joshua and the rest that Joshua gave us. It was great, but Christ is better. Now then, we're down to Aaron's priesthood was great, but Christ's priesthood is better. So that's the thing now that we're going to be talking about tonight, is the priesthood of Christ. Now the purpose of chapter 7 is merely to show the superiority of Christ's priesthood over Aaron's. Now keep in mind, the writer here is writing to the Jews. The Jews have lived all of their life under the law of Moses and the priesthood of Aaron. And so they were converted to Christ, but for the past 30 years, they've been kind of drifting away. The Hebrew writer says, you have been neglecting, you have been drifting, you are sluggish. And so he's trying to get them to see how important Christ is, so they'll not just slowly but surely drift back into Judaism. So now, tonight, we're going to be comparing the priesthood of Christ to the priesthood of Aaron. Now, the priesthood of Christ, let's keep in mind, started back in chapter 4 and in verse 14. And it goes all the way through chapter 7. This whole thing is about the priesthood of Christ. But when he mentioned Melchizedek in chapter 5, verse 10, then in verse 11, he takes off on that parenthesis that we were talking about. And he exhorts them and rebukes them and tells them about how slow and dull that they have been. So that section now is in there for a rebuke for the people. Now then, he comes back tonight in chapter 7, verse 1, and picks up with Melchizedek talking about the priesthood of Christ. So as you can see, if you started reading chapter 4, verse 14, you come down to chapter 5, verse 10. He mentions Melchizedek. Then you skip all the way down to chapter 7, verse 1. There he mentions Melchizedek, and he starts talking about him again. Now that's what we're in tonight. So I just wanted to go through this because for the past 2 or 3 weeks, we've been talking about how dull they are. We've been talking about the various things, and we forget that we're still on the priesthood of Christ there. Now, as we look at the priesthood of Christ and the priesthood of Aaron, we've seen this, that here is the way that it was presented. That Aaron was called out from among the Jews to function as a priest. And Christ was called out among people. That's the reason he came to this earth, to be born here as a human being, so he could go through life, suffer all the things that we suffer, and then he could function as our priesthood in heaven, because he's experienced every temptation that we have experienced. So there we have now these two that we're going to be talking about. Now the first argument that we're going to be getting into in chapter 7 is merely this. Christ was a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Now Melchizedek was not only greater than Aaron, but he was also greater than Levi, and he was even greater than the father of the nation, Abraham. Now I want to make that again clear. I didn't say Christ is greater than Aaron. I said Melchizedek was greater than Aaron. Melchizedek was greater than Levi. And Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. That kind of shocks our ears just a little bit, doesn't it? Because if you ask 100 people or 100,000 people, who's the greatest man of the Old Testament? What would the answer come back to be? Abraham. He's the father of our nation. He's the father of the faithful. He is the, and on and on you would go, it would be Abraham. But Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. that's what we're going to be seeing here tonight. Now, when I mention Melchizedek, what's the thing that comes to your mind? Come on, don't be bashful. Say everything comes to your mind. Melchizedek, what do you think about?
Who was he?
Okay, who was he? Without father, without mother, right? I mean, we get that down here. He's without father, without mother. Well, here it is. Do we have a man? How did he get here? Was he never born? Did he never die? We get caught up on that statement, and we're going to deal with that statement tonight. But the reason I'm bringing it up right now is because that's the statement that we always get caught up on. And have you ever noticed a lot of times in the Bible and out of the Bible, when you're trying to solve a problem, you go down and you're solving this problem, and then you hit something else that you don't understand, and so you start camping on that, and you start putting all your emphasis on that, and you get sidetracked till you're out here dealing with something that really you don't have to deal with. All right, that's what we think about Melchizedek. Without father, without mother, without end, without beginning. How could that be? All right, for right now, I want you to forget that, because that's an important thing only in one way, and we're going to come back to it here in just a moment. The important thing in this whole section is that Christ is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek was greater than even Abraham. And so we're going to be able to see that's what the Hebrew writer is going to be looking at and what we'll be studying here tonight. Now then, as we start out in here in chapter 7, verse 1, it said, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed them, to whom also Abraham divided a tenth part of all, being first by interpretation king of righteousness, then king of Salem, which is king of peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made unto the like unto the Son of God, abideth the priest forever." Now, here's where the Hebrew writer introduces us to Melchizedek. So let's just stop, take a breath, let's take a look at this and see what it is that he's talking about in here. Of where he's talking that Abraham went out and he was returning from the slaughter of the kings. Now, Abraham met Melchizedek one time. In fact, the only thing we know about Melchizedek is what we're going to learn in these next few verses right here. Don't know anything else about him. Just all of a sudden he's there, all of a sudden he's gone. And so tonight, in the next few minutes, we're going to learn everything there is to learn about Melchizedek, this great man. So let's go back, and this story is in Genesis, the 14th chapter. Now, if you turn back to Genesis 14th chapter, what you find out is this. I want you to look at the map first. Here is Hebron. This is where Abraham was living. And over here is Sodom, Gomorrah, Admar, and a few other cities. Now, over here is Sodom and Gomorrah. You remember who left Abraham and went down to Sodom? Lot. That's right. He went down there to Sodom. Now, Lot is living down in Sodom. Now, as you start reading here in chapter 14, the first 13 verses, there you find that there were some kings, about 5 kings. And they got together in a coalition, and they went down and conquered those 3 kings, Sodom and Gomorrah. And they took all of the people they wanted for slaves. They took all the material out of there. They conquered them. And so what is called a spoil belonged to them. So away they start going with Lot and with everything that those people owned. Now a report was brought over to Hebron, to Abraham, what these kings had done. Abraham was a very mighty man. He had his own army. So Abraham took off, and the only way he could go over there is up and around the Dead Sea. Going the other way is almost an impossibility. So you got to go up, you go around the Dead Sea and down. He went down and he conquered those kings. Went down and conquered those kings, got Lot back, gave Lot everything that he had right there. So we'll start in verse 13. Now there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew how he dwelt by the oaks of Mamre in here, and the Amorite, and so forth and so on. And when Abram heard that his brother had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318, and pursued as far as Dan. And the way he goes on down, talking about getting down there. So now he goes down and he conquers them. And in verse 17, and the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him and so forth, in their vale. And the same is the king's vale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was priest of God Most High. Now this is where Abraham, he meets him. So now look, as you're looking here, this is kind of important. He goes down and he conquers them. Now then, the only way he can get back is to come back up around the Dead Sea, come back up over there, 19 miles on the other side of that Dead Sea, he runs into a town. And that town is called Salem. Now, what name do we know it by? Salem, Jerusalem. We know it by the name of Jerusalem. So there's where Jerusalem is. But the first time we run across it, it's a town by the name of Salem, which means peace. And Melchizedek is the king of Salem. Now keep in mind, today we think about kings being kings of countries. But in Bible times, kings were not only kings of countries, but kings were kings of cities. So he was this king here now of Salem. So he comes out and he meets him. And now then, look in verse 18. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was priest of God Most High. Now that's kind of interesting. Here it is, he was a king of Salem, and he was a priest of whom? An idol? No, priest of God Most High. He was a priest of Jehovah. Now answer this riddle for me. I thought you couldn't be a priest unless you came from the tribe of Levi. What's the answer to that? Levi had never been born. We never heard of Levi. The law hadn't been given yet, see? And so Levi is going to be way down there, hundreds of years on down later. Now, here it is. God has Melchizedek, and he's a priest of God Most High. Now, we can start letting our imagination run away with us, and that's my job not to let it get too far out of the way there. So if you start asking me questions, I can say, I don't know. But there's not much you know about him. But here's an interesting thing. And that is that a lot of times we get the idea and the concept that God just gave up the Gentiles. They didn't have any relationship with the Gentiles at all, after he'd called Abraham. But after he called Abraham, did God have a priest among those Gentiles by the name of Melchizedek? Now, he was. Now, what is a priest? Let's keep this in mind. A priest, and especially a high priest. What is a priest? He's a man who can offer sacrifices that God will accept. And so here's a man that was offering sacrifices to God that God would accept. Now, I want you to ask me where he came from. I want you to ask me what God told him. I want you to ask me why he could do this. I want you to ask me why God picked that out. I want you to ask me when he became king of Salem. I want you to ask me all these questions, okay? I'm going to go take a nap, then I'm going to come in and say, I don't know. I don't know. Don't know anything about it. I'm just telling you, this is all we know. Now, he was there's another thing that's interesting. He was a king and also a what? A priest. So he was a king and a high priest. Keep that in mind, because that's going to be a big thing when we start comparing Christ with Aaron. By the way, if you're going to be a priest under the law of Moses, what tribe did you have to come from? Had to come from Levi, didn't you? See, you had to come from Levi. And if you were going to be a king, what tribe did you have to come from? Judah. Is there any way on earth that any man could have been a king and a priest at the same time of the law of Moses? No. Impossibility. Here's a guy that was a king and a priest. But now, why could he be? Because the law of Moses hadn't been put in effect yet. That's not going to happen until another 400 years on down the line, see, when the law of Moses comes into effect. So Abraham comes back, and he meets him now. So here you have a king and a priest on high. 19, and he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who hath delivered thine enemies unto thy hand. So now, not only did Melchizedek, was he a king and a priest, but he was a king and a priest of God Most High, and he blessed God Most High. He had this relationship with God Most High, and he was king, he was priest, and he blessed Abraham. Now, this is an interesting thing, and we're going to get into it here in just a moment. But who blesses whom? Is it the greater that blesses the lesser, or the lesser that blesses the greater? It's the greater that blesses the lesser. Today, you had President Bush and Alito, the new Supreme Court judge, and he's going to be sworn in. Guess who blessed whom? Who blessed whom? It was the president casting blessings upon Alito. Okay? And because the president has a higher office than Alito. And so Bush took a few minutes, talked about what a wonderful man he was, how much he appreciated him, and give him thanks for all of this. And here it is, he's blessing him in this way. It would be inappropriate for it to have been turned around the other way. And so the lesser then, how did he accept it? What did he do? Very humbly, yes, sir, I appreciate it. Thank you, sir. See, he did this. But it's the greater that blesses the less here. Now, who received the blessing? Melchizedek gave it to Abraham. Now, another thing, and he gave him a tenth of all. Now, who's the he gave him? Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth of all. Now, the reason we know that, you can keep on reading right here. And the king of Sodom said unto Abraham, Give me the persons and take the goods thyself. And Abram said unto the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand unto Jehovah, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I'll not take a thread. And so Abraham is saying, Nope, I will not take anything, and I'm giving you 1/10. Now, this is an interesting thing, and that is that when we run across a tenth, we generally think of it being the Old Testament command, don't we, that the Jews gave a tenth or a tithe? But here you have the giving of a tenth that was way back hundreds of years before the law. And Jacob also gave a tenth, a tithe. That 10% seems to be a number that's been with us throughout the world, of where religious people giving to, shall you say, the work of God or the economy of God or whatever you call it, is that's a reasonable figure to give. So Abraham, he then gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything that he had taken. Now there's your Old Testament story. The Old Testament story. So here's what you find. Melchizedek just appeared without any history given. Abraham is coming back. Abraham steps out. Melchizedek steps out. That's it. Where'd he come from? What's his genealogy? How old is he? Nobody knows. He just appeared on the scene. That's all that we got. Now that doesn't mean that he didn't have a dad and mom. See? It just means that nobody knows anything about his dad and mom. What do you know about him? He appeared on the scene. Now Melchizedek was a king and a priest at the same time. Melchizedek blessed Abraham, and the greater blesses the lesser. And Melchizedek receives tithes from Abraham, and the greater is the one that receives tithes from the lesser. So we begin to see that story. That's the end of the story. That's it. What happened to Melchizedek? Don't know. Did he go back into town? I don't know. He may have had a heart attack before he got into town. Whatever happened to him? I don't know. Did he die? I don't know. Where'd he go? I don't know. Now here's the whole thing that I'm trying to say. What do you know about Melchizedek? See, this is one of those things of where we've talked before. God raised up David, God raised up Solomon, God did a whole lot of things and events to use as an example to show us certain things. Here it is, God has this man, and this man will one day be used to compare to Christ, compare him and Aaron to show the superiority of Christ. And what do you know about the man? He came, he did something, and he went. That's what it means without father and without mother. Now there are historical statements, and I didn't bring any, but there are historical statements where the Gentiles and the Greeks and so forth would use that terminology. When they didn't know the ancestry of somebody, they would say, well, they're without father or mother. Now, I think that you and I, in order to understand this a little bit better, would need to understand how important was genealogies to the people before us, to the Jewish nation. See? Tremendous. Everything revolved around and rested upon genealogy. How important are genealogies to Americans? Not important at all. Now, there are some people that try to trace them back. Roger, how far can you take yours back? 1,300. I've never heard anybody could take them back that far. He has a great interest in it, and you ought to see his house and all of his records and so forth going back 1,300. How many generations is that? You can't. 16 or 18. I know my granddad. That's all I know. You see. And that's about the rest, what the rest of us is, isn't it? You see, in doing this. So genealogy is really not important to us. And but it was the whole thing to these people. It was their life. Just to give you an illustration, when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 A.D., the whole priesthood, the whole Jewish economy was destroyed. Even if Israel won the battle and they went over and they conquered the Palestinians and they took the Temple Mount and they built a temple again, they couldn't use it. Why? They don't know who the priests are. They lost their genealogies. It was destroyed. And so once you lose that genealogy, now they've had it. It cannot be put back together again. See? Genealogy was everything. So when you understand that, then you understand why we would probably say, well, I don't know who dad and mom was, doesn't make me any difference. And they'd say, well, doesn't have dad and mom. He just came on and, well, how many children did he leave? Nothing. All we know about him is he's here and he's gone. See? And that's what it means without father and without mother. So now, let's look at this. Here are the things now that the writer wants us to know about Melchizedek. This Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. So now he was a king and he was a priest at the same time, to whom Abraham divided a tenth. Abraham paid a tithe to him, being first by interpretation king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, which is king of priests, king of peace. So Melchizedek meant king of righteousness. He was king of Salem, which means king of peace. So he is a king that is built upon righteousness and peace. That ring a bell with you for Christ? What kind of a king, you see, we would have for him? Now these are the important things that he wants us to see in there. And then he was without father, without mother, without genealogy, neither beginning of days or end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Now this is what he's saying here. This is the verse in the third verse, that what kind of a priest was Melchizedek? When was his beginning? When was his ending? What do you know about him? He was a high priest. See? He was a high priest. Now that's the way it is with Christ. See? That's the way it is with him. When will his ending be? What do you know about Christ? See? When was his beginning? What do you know about him? He exists. He's here. He's a priest forever. And a little bit more will be made on this as we go on through. Okay, now then let's look right here. Read this again, because this is a little confusing to read it through there, and we may make a comment, may not. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed them, to whom Abraham divided the 10th part of all, being first by interpretation king of righteousness, that's Melchizedek, means king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, which is king of peace, so that's a city, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. What do we know about him? He was there. We don't know anything about his beginning, don't know anything about his ending. What do we know? He was there. He was there. But made like unto the Son of God abideth a priest continually. And so he was a priest. Now then, now consider how great this man was, unto whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth out of the chief spoils. And they indeed of the sons of Levi that received the priest office have commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though these have come out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose genealogy is not counted from them, that's Melchizedek, hath taken tithes of Abraham, and hath blessed him that hath the promises. But without any dispute, the less is blessed of the better. And here men that die receive tithes, but there of whom it is witnessed, he that liveth. And so to say, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, hath paid tithes, for he hath yet in his loins of his father, for he was yet in the loins of his father, when Melchizedek met him. Now let's put this together. Now here it is, we're going to be talking about that paying of tithes and blessings. And the whole point is to show Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. So let's look now at this. Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, Jacob begat the 12 patriarchs. Now one of those patriarchs that he begat was named Levi. And so here then we have this fella Levi, and Levi had several kids, and they had several kids, and they had several kids, and so you have thousands of people out here, and they're called Levites. Now that's what the Bible means, what it talks about, and the Levites. And the Levites did this, and the Levites did that. Now, notice something else. Here it is. Levi had another boy, and his name was Aaron. Now, was Aaron a Levite? He was a Levite. He came from Levi, just like all these other guys, see? So they were all Levites. Aaron would have been a Levite, but Aaron was a very special Levite, because Aaron was the Levite through whom God said the priesthood would come. So all the priests are going to come through Aaron. Aaron's boys, their boys, their boys, they would be the priest. Now let's notice this distinction. That is, was Aaron a Levite? Were the Levites priests? No. No, the Levites weren't priests, only through Aaron. Only through the family of Aaron. Now, here's the interesting thing. God told him, he said, now I want all the Levites, I'm going to give the land, when we get over in the land of Canaan, I'm going to divide up the land among all of these 12 patriarchs, except the tribe of Levi doesn't get any land. And I'm going to give the tribe of Levi 48 different cities. They're going to be scattered throughout the land. And the Levites will live in those cities, where it'll all be distributed out throughout the land. And these Levites are going to be functioning, here I'm at a loss of words because I can't say as priest, but they're going to be functioning, helping the priest offer the sacrifices, carry the temple. There's going to be, the Levites had special jobs to do. Only the Levites could carry the pieces of the temple, set it up, tear it down. Only the Levites could bring in the sacrifices and bring them in, but only the priest could offer the sacrifices, see? So the Levites were the helpers of the priest. So now, all of the priests were Levites, but were all the Levites priests? That's a distinction that I want us to see. So now, as it comes down here then, God chose only through the Levites, only through Levi will we have all of these things that are given. Now, Abraham met Melchizedek. And when he met Melchizedek, we've already learned now that he paid him tithes. And not only did he pay him tithes, but Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And we've learned about these two things. These two things show Melchizedek was greater than Abraham. But now in this chart, I want you to notice, we keep building it. I want you to notice there's two sections to this chart. There's that black section that starts down Abraham and goes on down. And up there is Melchizedek and his relationship to Abraham. And he was over Abraham. Now, when you talk about paying tithes, all Jews paid tithes to the Levites. Every Jew had to give 10% of what they had. And they took it and they gave it to the Levites. Now that's how the Levites lived. That was their income. Remember I told you a minute ago that Levites didn't have any property, they didn't have any farms, they didn't have any fruit trees, they didn't have any, all they had was these cities. Well, how'd they live? All the Jews paid them 10%. And so they got 10% of the entire Jewish nation, and that's how they sustained themselves. Now here's another interesting thing, and that is that the Levites over here, they then paid tithes to the priest. And so it says they paid tithes on their tithes. So they gave the priest 10% of what they got, and that's how the priests were sustained economically, see? So they could give their full attention to that. But now then, here we have the tithes that are given. So who paid tithes to whom? Look at this. Who paid tithes to whom? Was it the lesser to the greater? In other words, God chose Levi. He said, your seed. And all the Jews had to pay tithes to the Levites. And then the Levites had to pay tithes to whom? To the priest. Had to pay tithes to the priest. And so that's how they paid tithes, because they were interrelated. They were related one to the other. But up here with Melchizedek, he got these tithes without any relationship whatsoever. We got this because Abraham noted in the man the greatness and the honor and paid him tithes. Now then in verse 8, it comes down and it says, now here, and that's talking about down here, this, here there's death. Up here, this is forever. He lives forever. Now the whole point is, down here, how do you tell who the high priest is going to be? See, under the Levitical system, now I'm going to start using two words. Under the Levitical priesthood, do you see why it would be called the Levitical priesthood? Because Aaron was from Levi. And it's called the Aaronic priesthood. Why would it be called the Aaronic priesthood? Because only Aaron and his seed could function as priest. So now, down here, how are you going to tell who the high priest is? Takes death. When Aaron died, his oldest son took over. When he died, his oldest son took over. When he died, his oldest son took over. And so down here, you have death. Up here, you don't have any death. When you're dealing with the priesthood of Melchizedek, there's no such thing as death. But with the Levitical priesthood, there is such a thing as death. Now, before we go any farther, let's go back now and let's read starting in verse 4, and we'll read what we've shown up here on the chart. Now consider how great this man was, unto whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth out of the chief spoils. And they indeed of the sons of Levi that received the priest office have commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is, of their brethren, though these have come out of the loins of Abraham. So now, God told the priest, I want you to take tithes of all of the Jews, even though all the Jews have come out of the loins of Abraham, they're your brethren. That's how you're going to pay tithes. You're going to pay tithes because of your physical relationship. See, how did Abraham pay tithes? He wasn't related to Melchizedek at all. He paid tithes to Melchizedek because he recognized the greatness of Melchizedek. See, it didn't make any difference about a high priest under the Aaronic or the Levitical priesthood. He could have been a scoundrel, and they had scoundrels. And you still had to pay tithes because of the physical relationship. This is the thing the Hebrew writer is trying to build for us. And that is the Levitical relationship was based on a physical relationship, not so with Melchizedek. Now then 6. But he whose genealogy is not counted of them that hath taken tithes of Abraham, and hath received him, and hath blessed him that hath the promise. So now Melchizedek has no relationship to Abraham, but he got the tithes anyway. But without any dispute, the less is blessed of the better. We talked about it. And here, that is down here in the Levitical priesthood, and here men that die receive tithes. Down here, people that die receive tithes. The priests come and go. They live and they die. They're physical, and still they receive these tithes. But there, up there with Melchizedek, of whom it is witnessed that he liveth. The only one thing you know about Melchizedek, he was here. He was here. So now in verse 9, we're getting ready to show this now on the chart. And so to say, I said I'm going to say this. This is, you might think this is not literally true, but so to say it is what he's saying. Through Abraham, even Levi, who receiveth tithes, hath paid tithes. 10 tells us how he did it. For he was yet in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So down here, Levi, a man that his tribe receives tithes, he, along with Abraham, paid tithes because he was still in Abraham's bosom. So now then we turn it around. Levi also paid tithes up here to Abraham as you go on up, just like Abraham paid them, because Levi was still in his loins, still part of this family. Now, this is what you would call representative, I guess, in this way. Are you as Americans, are you at war in Iraq tonight? Are you at war? Well, are you over there fighting? Did you cause it? Did you sign a piece of paper? Have you sent a soldier over? What have you done about that war? What have you done to initiate that war? Absolutely nothing. How are you at war? When it says we're at war, how are you at war? What's that?
Representative government.
Your representative government. You are at war through your government. It stands as the head, and you are at war through what they do. See? And this is true everything. If John D. Rockefeller used to own the Standard Oil Company. Now, there may be a lot of people in here that never heard of the Standard Oil Company. Have you heard of the Standard Oil Company? Oh, hold up your hand if you haven't. I know you haven't. Okay. Allie and I are the only ones that haven't heard of it because we are young. Okay. There was a Standard Oil Company. It was one of the first big oil companies. There wasn't any Exxon. There wasn't any Shell. There wasn't any of this, all this stuff that you see around here. There was Standard. John D. Rockefeller owned the whole thing. I mean, you talk about rich. He he had it. He was the oil man. He was it. Then things happened and he had to break it up and sell it off in there. Now, the Rockefellers today, do they own Standard Oil Company? There is no Standard Oil Company. The Rockefellers sold it off. So the Rockefellers today say, no, we sold that 100 years ago. Well, how did that rich grandchild of a Rockefeller today, how did he sell Standard Oil Company? Through his great-great-great-granddad, see? This is how Abraham paid tithes. But here's the important thing for us to see. The important thing is, who paid tithes to whom? Levi paid tithes up there. So now let's look at the Levitical priesthood and the law. Try to get this in the next 5 minutes here. In verse 11, now if there were perfection through the Levitical priesthood, for under it hath the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek and not be reckoned after the order of Aaron? So now, he says, if there was perfection through the Levitical priesthood. So down here now you have the Levitical priesthood in all of this sense. And if there were perfection under this system, what further need would there be for another system? Let's just suppose that there were perfection back there. But first of all, we have to define perfection. What do we mean by perfection? Complete, finished, accomplished whatever is supposed to be accomplished. Now, let's just suppose back here, under the Levitical priesthood, all sins could have been washed away. Were they? No, we know they weren't. Later on in the 11th chapter, he's going to get back into, or the 10th chapter, he's going to get back into this again. But let's suppose that the blood of bulls and goats and so forth could have washed away sins. We could have been free from our sins. We could have been saved. Would there have been any need for Christ to have come and died on the cross and become another high priest? So if there was perfection back here, no, wouldn't be any need of it in here. Now, the Levitical priesthood is called after the order of Aaron. So it says right here in this, if there had been perfection through the Levitical priesthood here, after the order of Aaron, now, all of this thing was Levitical priesthood, but after the order of Aaron, that's what the real priest had in there. Now, here we have Levi had another boy. Aaron had a brother. His name was Moses. Now, Aaron's a high priest, and what did Moses give him? See, Aaron was a priesthood, but Moses gave him the law. Now, it says, under this priesthood, this law was given. That's a statement that shows us that the law really rests on the priesthood. The law was given, and how much of the law told the priest what to do and how to offer sacrifices and when to offer sacrifices? That was the purpose of the law, was to try to take those Jews, and Moses gave the law, then the priest would take the law and administer the law to all of the Jews at that time to try to make them the best Jews that they could possibly make them there. Now, if there was perfection through the Levitical priesthood then, there wouldn't have been any need for anything. But I want us to know this. The Jewish nation in the time of Christ and before, that's what they thought would bring them perfection. See? That's what they thought. They thought keeping the law was the end of the whole thing, that was a great thing. Paul said, for I bear them witness that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of God's righteousness, that's being ignorant of the way God makes man righteous, excuse me, being ignorant of the way God makes man righteous. Now, did God make man righteous through the blood of bulls and goats? No. All right. being ignorant of that, and seeking to establish their own righteousness, they thought that they could be righteous by their works. Now let me ask you if that has changed any in the Jewish nation today. In the Jewish nation today, they don't have any term in their religion that has to do with salvation because they're not saved. They're Jews. Well, how does it come to pass? Well, in the 2 or 3 discussions I've heard, the rabbis teach, if you do more good works than you do bad works, then it's all calculated out at the end of time, and whatever happens to you, they're not sure what happens to you, will be good. That'll be the good thing. So you can be saved then, what we would think, through these works. I heard a rabbi one time, and I have this on tape, by the way. Years ago, we were having some meetings, and my time's up in about 1 more minute, so I'm just going to tell the story, and then we'll close and start out here. But it was a long time ago, 20, 25 years ago. We were having a meeting over at Silver Lake, and so we'd have a gospel preacher to preach on what is wrong with the Baptist church or the Methodist or something. And then the next week, then that preacher would come in, and then he would answer and say this or that then. And so they invited in a rabbi, Hebrew rabbi. And so this guy got up and he was telling about their system. And that is that the great thing is to be a Jew. And it's just a wonderful thing. And he described what it is. Being a Jew is a way of life. And so you try to ask him, well, what do you do being a Jew here? And so it's just a way of life. Don't you understand? It's a way of life. It's the way you think. It's the way you act. It's the clothes you wear and the food you eat. It's a way of life. And so they get down to this, and so finally he said, they asked him what he thought about being a Christian. And no, that's not being a Jew. And the important thing is to be a Jew. He said, how do you put it? He said, I would rather for my child to be an atheist Jew than a Christian. Because if you're an atheist Jew, everything's fine. But if you're a Christian, it's not. Because you see, the important thing is being a Jew. The food you eat, the way you think, and on down the line. And working out their own salvation. Being a Jew is a way of life. That's the thing. We can talk about it a whole lot more, but that's the big thing. That's what Paul's talking about right here. You're trying to work out your own salvation. That's not going to work. Class dismissed.